With our talk, yeah, most of you know our wonderful speaker today, who has been the Fairview historian for what, at least 10 years, if not more. Sue, I'm
About
sorry
20.
I don't have a write-up in front of me. But she started out volunteering there, and it just grew as a passion. And we are so grateful for her passion, because I think Albuquerque has benefited greatly from her years of researching and identifying graves. And she's the go-to person if a family member wants to know, well, where was grandma or great grandpa buried at Fairview? She can usually tell them. And if she can't right away, she'll do some research and figure it out. And it's just a wonderful service to our community. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our wonderful Susan Schwartz from Florida.
Should I do it now, Diane?
Yep. Share screen. Yep.
Okay. Here we go. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to share some of the information I have about Fairview Cemetery. It's been there 140 years, so there's a lot of information, whether it's on the cemetery itself or some of the residents buried there. And it was really hard to decide what to put into this talk. So there's people that you may know that I've neglected, or people that I put in there, hopefully, that you don't know anything about. And that's what makes it exciting. So thank you, Diane, for inviting me to do this. I've also started a blog for the cemetery where we've posted about close to 70 stories, with about 70 more that need to be written, of people or maps or whatever. At the end of the talk, I'll go ahead and put up the blog address so that you can visit it if you're interested. Anyway, to start with, the cemetery is located, in case someone doesn't know, at 700 Yale Southeast, and it's on the northeast corner of Yale and Cesar Chavez. When you come through the gates, you'll be coming through the gates of Fairview Memorial Park, which is the active perpetual care side. If you turn to the left or the north, it's historic Fairview Cemetery, and there's an obvious difference between the perpetual care and the non-perpetual care area. Historic Fairview is the oldest non-denominational, all-inclusive cemetery in Albuquerque. There is one cemetery still existing that's older than Fairview. It's the Catholic Cemetery, which is Santa Barbara, and that has been combined with Mount Calvary there on Edith and Indian School. Okay. Oops, sorry, went too far. Anyway, Mary Josephine Perea is Fairview's earliest known burial. The date on her headstone is February 27th of 1881. Unfortunately, the office does not have any documentation on her burial. All the information that we have is from the headstone and census that she was born. Mary Josephine was the daughter of Jose Inez Perea and Susan Gates Perea of the well-known Perea lineage. Jose was Manal School's first Hispanic minister. Susan was a school teacher in Corrales, and she's until she started raising her children, and then the records seem to indicate she stayed at home and no longer was teaching. The headstone, each side of it, there's 4 sides, has 5 names on it total. 5 of the 8 Perea children died and are buried in the family plot out there. The plot is very large, and so in addition to the children, Jose is buried there, and a woman named Celia Morgan. And Celia Morgan was a friend of the family. She was a school teacher in Corrales with Susan Gates. When she got ill, the Perea family promised her parents, which were out on the East Coast, that they would take care of her internment. And so she is buried in the Perea family plot also. Susan died some years after Jose, and her and one of her sons are buried in Kansas in a cemetery there. Now this is kind of fun. This is the one, Casa Prea in Corrales. It still exists. Right now it's an art center. I lived there in 1974. This is the main sala. And it started off, according to the records, and the Prea family is a very small house, and they kept extending it and making it larger. At this point, it sits at about 5,000 square feet. This, and at this other end of the sala, which I'm not showing for privacy reasons, is an altar that came out of San Isidro Church. And this is the privacy reasons I'm not sharing the rest of the picture. I was married there in the sala of Casa Prea back in '74. The next earliest or oldest burial that we're aware of is James Eulery. He died the early part of April in 1881, so just a little bit after the Prea girl. This headstone is my favorite headstone or burial grounds. This side is James, this side is his wife Nellie, and it's a very unique looking burial plot. I don't know if they're buried underneath the slab or in the slab. So I had to show that one because that actually is my favorite burial plot. An editorial that was written by Elias Stover in the Albuquerque Morning Journal, which was dated November 28th of 1882, brought up the question of a cemetery. Right here is the editorial that I have printed out. The beginning of it, I won't read the whole thing, but the beginning says, the present excuse for a cemetery was never intended to be a permanent institution. Situated along one side of a sand hill, it will only be a question of time when it will be obliterated. And then there's some other discussion. Then towards the very end, it continues, let us provide for the organization of a cemetery association at this meeting, one that will work immediately and select the ground, lay it off into lots, sell them, and with promises to improve and beautify them, so that in a short time, we have not only a decent place to bury our dead, but a resort to which we can with pride point the living. This was 140 years ago. Right here we have the Albuquerque Cemetery Association was started, and in 3 of the board members of the association was Franz Huning, Judge William Hazeldine, and Elias Stover, who had written the editorial. And Fairview by 1883 was considered an official cemetery. But that's not the beginning of Fairview. There was things going on before then. And the land, of course, was owned by the government, and it was sold to a gentleman or purchased by a gentleman named Edward Ulysses Bliss. He was an Albuquerque businessman. He owned the land where these burials that Mr. Stover was concerned about were taking place. Mr. Bliss was widowed when he moved to Albuquerque, which according to the Albuquerque Masonic Lodge application was about 1883 to 1885. This is when he transferred his membership from the Masons in Missouri to Albuquerque. So I can't pinpoint the date, but that's kind of a good guesstimate. At some point after he moved here, he acquired an untreatable social disease. So he spent the last 2 years of his life in the state hospital in Las Vegas, New Mexico. According to the hospital records, he was a well-educated and quiet man. He was admitted to the hospital in May 24th of 1900, and he died in 1902. This is a picture. The hospital has 3 cemeteries there in Las Vegas. This is a picture of the oldest cemetery. We're not sure where Mr. Bliss was buried, but this is in this location or in this particular cemetery is where he was buried. This slide shows the quitclaim deed from Mr. Bliss to the Albuquerque Cemetery Association. And as you can see, it was dated April 14th of 1888. It's kind of hard to read, so I had it transcribed over here so it can be much easier to read. This slide is the land certificate, shows the inner ownership of the Fairview, the lot 27 is what it's called, section 27, to Mr. Bliss. Now we're going to go to the Strong family. They were just passing through Albuquerque in the year of 1881 when their oxen died on the northwest corner of Copper and 2nd Street. They decided to stay, and that's where they opened a furniture store. Orrin William and his brother Charles H. purchased C.D. Favor's undertaking business in 1882. And according to what I've read, C.D. Favor was working his business out of the back of a saloon. And down here we have an advertisement with the initials of Orrin Strong's sons. It's Frank H. and Harry O. And I just love this picture of their hearse. It's from 1925. There are two Orrin Strongs, so this can get confusing. The original Orrin Strong is this one, and he came to Albuquerque. Well, he was listed in the 1900 Albuquerque City Directory as Fairview Cemetery Superintendent. The Strong brothers, Frank and Harry, procured the cemetery from Elias Stover in 1906. So he's the one that came into Albuquerque with the two, and then the sons procured the cemetery. Anyway, and they ran it under the auspice of Albuquerque Cemetery Association until it was closed in the 1980s. And that I verified through the Strong family. In 1938, the Strongs built a new mortuary, which was located at 1100 Cole Southeast, closing the downtown location. They owned and operated from the Cole location until its sale in the 1980s. His grandson, which is right here, Orrin Strong, continued in the family business, both the cemetery and the mortuary. And this was open for about real close to a century, and he sold it in the 1980s. This is one of the original maps. And what you're looking at here is a copy of it. The original was printed on linen and it was rolled up like a window shade. It was in the possession of Linda Dietz until she loaned it to me in 2016. After I had it copied, which is what you're looking at is the copy, we donated to the Special Collections Library. It was not dated, but after researching the differences between the map and how the burials had actually taken place out there, I have dated it between the 1920s and 1930s. And we'll come back to a different version of the map a little later. This is a photo of the Yacht family, and it's one of the family member burials. We don't have an exact date, which burial, whether it was the one in 1917 or one in 1919. It was donated to the Albuquerque Museum by the Yacht family. Notice the sand hills that were mentioned by Elias Stover back in his editorial in 1882. Unfortunately, we don't see the sandias in the background, so I'm assuming that they were coming into the cemetery from the north side, which means you wouldn't see the sand hill, the mountains. Here we have a photograph of the Viat family. Joseph from Canada and Augustus was from Germany with their children. When they moved to Albuquerque between 1890 and 1894, they purchased 5 acres of land suitable for farming off of 12th Street. The house, which is located at 3541 12th Street, is still standing today and is in the New Mexico Historic Landmark Registry. And of course, through the years, it's changed and they've had to raise it because of flooding and everything, but it is still there. The Yacht family were some of the Albuquerque's earliest movers and shakers. They were involved in a lot of different activities. Leroy was a violinist and a music teacher. He and his wife, Sarah, had a studio in the Barnett building downtown. In the 1920s, he conducted a series of music ensembles. In the 1930s, Leroy and Sarah, with their Junior Symphony Orchestra from Albuquerque, were presented in the World's Fairs in both Chicago and in New York. The Yacht family had a lot of antiques in their garages, and they gave me a copy of this, and I think the Albuquerque Museum has it now. Frank Yacht owned the Yacht Cleaners and Hanners. He started the business in 1915 at 114 South 3rd Street. By 1921, he had moved to 703 Kelleher Avenue. And look at this car, I just find really amazing and I feel very fortunate to have a copy of it. Kind of Roland style, I think. Their descendants owned the Yacht's Beauty Shop from 1932 until 1960. From 1932 until 1950, it was located at 211 South 4th Street. When they sold, then they moved it over in 1950 to 734 Manala Northwest, and they sold it to someone else who proceeded in the business for a while in 1960, excuse me. Need to slow down a little bit. Here's historic Fairview Cemetery's front gates, the ones that they would have entered back after the 1920s when these gates were built. They're fairly narrow here, as you can see. I kind of have a chuckle out of this. I know I took this picture because if you ever see a picture with an orange in the gutter, that's my picture. And I typed my name on one of the branches just for fun and used it for my business card for a lot of years. The gate was built by Angelo Di Tullio. He was a general contractor and builder. He was known for his cast stone, which can be seen in several of the homes in the Union's Highland District. He patented the carpenter's level in 1916. He was involved with the building of the Barnett Building, the Masonic Temple, and the Lion Fountain in Las Vegas, New Mexico. The front gates, like I just showed you in the previous picture, were built by him along with the pilasters and the original curbing that was surrounding the family plots. These were done between 1921 and 1924. Also, it mentioned flower beds that he had out there, which are gone now, so I don't even know where he had put those. Unfortunately, he's not buried at Fairview, and I'm not going to say where he's buried because we're only talking about Fairview. Here's the map that I work off of. I have a copy of it at home. It's a 3x5. Here are the earliest burials on the north side. This is Yale. They started in 1881 and they're done by rows. They rotate. Grave 1 starts here through 25, 26 through 50. And then the row 2 is this way, this way. Actually, these are ABC graves. Row A, row B, row C, all the way up to row Z. Up here we have military, well, the Elks Lodge is here, we have military here, we have family plots here. All these really decorative looking burials are family plots. These are family plots. We have 2 Masonic areas, another military area up here. The Springer Mausoleum is in here. It doesn't show it here. These are, well, here's Congregation Albert. Above Albert are the County South, County North, and just plain county areas. We have lots of baby areas, which the next slide I'll show you a photograph of. And I think that's about all I wanted to point out, but I use this map. There's 12,000 burials out there, nearly 12,000 burials on 17.5 acres. And unfortunately, there's only 5,700 headstones. So I use the map along with what's called the statistics cards and the progressive logs and walk these or figure these on a database, which I've made to figure out where all the burials are, or try to figure out where all the burials are. Here are some of the children's sections that I was talking about. They were buried from 1902 to 1920s in the front area. The 30s to the 50s is another burial area. This is by the perpetual care side, 1950 burials. Right across from it are 1960 burials, 1971 through 82 burials. The perpetual care side opened up in 1934. So we do have burials over there for both babies and adults, but these are the ones that I'm focusing on. Okay. This is kind of interesting. Located in section 18 child, which was the first one I showed you on the children's burials, is the leg of John McCoy of the famous Hatfield McCoy's clan. He moved to New Mexico to get away from the family feuding, but after leaving his home and settling in Thoreau, New Mexico, gunfire followed him. The 2 newspapers of the time reported the gunfire incident with slightly different versions, but the outcome was that John suffered a shattered leg due to the gunfire. His leg would not heal, so he was taken to St. Joseph's, where they amputated his leg. His leg was then buried in the children's section right here in Fairview Cemetery. He died some years later, and the rest of his body is in his hometown in Ohio. Then we go to something a little more serious. Colonel Francisco Perea. Perea was elected to the New Mexico 8th Legislative Assembly in 1858. He advocated for New Mexico to remain in the Union, and in 1861, at his own expense, he organized a volunteer battalion. He was commissioned as a regimental lieutenant colonel of Pereira's battalion. He led campaigns against the Apache and the Navajo Indians, believing that the Indian culture and the culture that was setting in New Mexico could not coexist together. He resigned from his position in 1862 and won the position of territorial delegate to the U.S. House in the 38th Congress in 1863. Pereira claims that he became close friends with President Abraham Lincoln, and he was at the theater sitting in the pit directly below when Lincoln was fatally shot. In addition to his political career, Pereira owned a resort hotel in 1881, and he served as postmaster of Jemez Springs between 1894 and 1905. Here's a picture of his headstone and his wife's headstone, Gabriella. He was buried in section 17, and when she passed away, they moved him to the current burial location in 9B, because that's where they were doing the burials then at that point. So he moved around a little bit even after death.
Okay, baby, I'm ready.
Ruth Hannah McCormick Sands. Ruth's first marriage was to Joseph and Dale McCormick from the Chicago Tribune family. They were married until his early death in 1925. He had severe emotional problems, and there was rumor that his death was caused by suicide. This was covered up for many years, but it had been exposed quite a few years later that it was a suicide. Ruth was active in the newspaper business, but it appears that her first love was politics. One of her goals was the reemergence of the suffragette movement. She wanted more states to allow women to vote, better working conditions, and equal representation. She did not want to compete with men. She wanted to be equal with them. In 1928, she was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where she served one term. Being defeated in 1930 election for the U.S. Senate, she returned to her newspaper interest. While she was serving in the House, she met Congressman Albert Sims from New Mexico, and they were married in 1932. Here's a picture of her and him in their little bit older years, and a picture of her headstone. Albert was a farmer, a rancher, and president of both the Albuquerque National Bank and a mortgage company. Together, they made the Albuquerque Academy possible when they gifted 12,000 acres and 7,500 shares of Albuquerque National Bank stock. The Sim purchased an 800-acre ranch in the North Valley known as Las Poblanas. It became their home, dairy farm, cultural, and educational center. Ruth founded Manzano Day School and Sandia School for Girls, known today as Sandia Preparatory School. John Medill McCormick was Ruth's son from her first marriage with Joseph. On June 22nd of 1938, John and Richard Whitmore went hiking in the Sandia Mountains. They appeared to be climbing a cliff when they fell from the top. Richard's crumbled body was recovered on the first day of the search, but John's body took a couple of days to recover. He was laying on a ledge that was almost inaccessible to get to. Both the boys were young. They were 20 and 21 years old. Services for John were held at Las Poblanas on July 22nd of 1938. It has been said that the large boulder in the family plot, which is right here, was brought down from the Sandias as a memorial from Ruth to her son. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard that story for years. So, and then the Albert and Ruth, they're there, and then John's there also. Edmund G. Ross served as a major in Company E of the 11th Kansas Cavalry during the Civil War. He was appointed to the U.S. Senate in 1866 to fill the seat of the deceased Kansas Senator James Lane. He served in this position until 1871. In 1868, there was a political campaign to impeach President Andrew Johnson. Senator Ross cast the deciding vote against the impeachment. He was heavily criticized and felt pressure to leave the Republican Party. He moved to New Mexico and he took a position with the Albuquerque Morning Journal. In 1885, he was appointed territorial governor of New Mexico by President Grover Cleveland. He served until 1889. While he was in office, he signed the bill creating the University of New Mexico. And on this, I'd like to note too that Richard Ruddy, an HAI member, has written a wonderful award-winning book on Edmund G. Ross. So if you have further interest, I would really recommend getting the book and reading it. This is the Ross family plot out in Fairview, very nice looking plot. And it's one that actually, that's the first plot I went to look for when I went in 2002, I believe it was. How I got involved with Fairview was I went to that plot, and it wasn't quite so nice back then.
Yep.
Okay, we have two areas designated for military burials. The first section is section 10D, American Legion number 1. The burials are dated from 1926 to 1941, and that's here. The second area is 18 American Legion number 2, with burials dating from 1942 until 1988. None of the individuals were on active duty at the time of their death. This here is the monument to the unknown soldier. They have worked on repairing it. The VA has allocated $300,000. They're going to come in and fix up these areas. They're going to put curbing around them, and I don't know what they're going to do on the inside, but it's their goal, and it's been passed that this year they should come in and renovate the two military areas. We also have burials for United States Marshals, World War veteran in the old section, Spanish American war vets, and Buffalo soldiers. We also have Woodmen of the World, Independent Order of Odd Fellows. There's a lot of different sections out there with different, even the Albuquerque Women's Club. These areas are designated for that. There is designation for the colored burials, the Native American burials, and stillborn. That does not mean the people were segregated. It simply means that if you wanted to be buried in these areas, you could be buried with your church group or your military group or whatever, but there was not segregation, which on my blog, I've proven that. We had Buffalo soldiers, as I said, and one of them that I would like to recognize, and we have a lot of information on, was, well, there's 13 Buffalo soldiers out there, but it's Isaac Jackson. He was a slave in Kentucky until he enlisted in the U.S. Colored Infantry in 1863. His first enlistment was in Company K, Kentucky, 109th Infantry, U.S. Colored Volunteer Infantry. He served in several infantries during his military career. He was a private and a musician during the Civil War and was promoted from corporal to sergeant before he retired. According to his obituary, he was a scout in the New Mexico and Arizona. He led forces during the Geronimo's uprising to an Indian encampment, which led to the capture of Geronimo. After his military service, he was the head jailer at the Albuquerque jail for 6 months before his death. His headstone's laying out in the area on the north side, just laying there. It's been put up several times, but people seem to keep knocking it over. So there is a picture of it knocked over, unfortunately. Henry Julius Schwartz. Henry was born in Russia in 1880, and he was orphaned at an early age. He was sent to Germany to live with Schwartz's family, and he learned the craft of harness making, obedience, and orderliness from Mr. Schwartz. At the age of 14, he discovered that he was not Schwartz's son. He returned to Russia, where he worked as a sailor, and later joined the German Navy, where he began training as a chef. Schwartz arrived in the United States in 1901 and started his career as a chef at the Ambassador Hotel in New York City. Later, he worked as a chef at the White House under President Theodore Roosevelt. He oversaw the wedding reception as well as baked the wedding cake for Alice Roosevelt and Nicholas Longworth. This picture is a picture of the White House kitchen during the time that Schwartz was there. I do not know who this person is. It's unidentified, but it's really kind of fun to see the picture during that year that he was there. And here is a picture of the wedding. Henry died of tuberculosis in 1936, and he's laid to rest in an unmarked but identified grave in historic Fairview Cemetery. And here you can see where his grave is. Over here is the perpetual site of the cemetery. Robert Dietz II moved from Albuquerque in 1910 to chase the cure for tuberculosis. In 1914, he had met Barbara Johnson and they were married. They purchased 40 acres on Rio Grande and Griegos, and they moved into a modest home that was already on the property. They farmed the land and later expanded it to 150 acres, which is known as Dietz Farm. Here's the original house. Here's the house now. Richard Ruddy took this picture in 1977. A beautiful picture and a beautiful home. In 1840, grandfather Robert Edwin Dietz started the R.E. Dietz Company in New York. The company manufactured kerosene and fuel lanterns that were used for residential, commercial, railroad, and automotive use. Linda Dietz shared with me these photos from one of their family collections that are still out east. And there's so many different types of Dietz lanterns in here. It's I find very interesting. When Robert and Barbara Dietz moved back to New York in 1952, Robert Dietz III and his wife Anne moved into the large home. They managed the farm until 1959, when they sold the property to developer Dale Bellema. He subdivided it and built houses on it, but it was still known as Dietz Farm. The original home was sold in 1969 to Shirley Leslie. Robert Dietz III and his wife Anne Augusta S.B. Dietz had 4 children, a daughter named Gary, Robert IV, Theodore, and Ethelinda, known as Linda. Robert, Anne, and Gary are interred in the Dietz family plot. And she was the last interment into the plot. They do not bury out there anymore, but if you have a family plot and you'll do a cremation, there were a few burials done, quote unquote, in recent years, as her death is 1912. And as most of the women here will say, he was a pretty handsome gentleman. On the west side of the cemetery, running parallel to Yale, is the Randall family plot. Pictured are Raymond Sr., Raymond Jr., and my friend, Raymond III, looking pretty young there. And here you can see it's running against Yale and the bus companies across the street. Raymond Sr. and his son Raymond Jr. purchased Zenith Cleaners from Henry Cochran in 1946 for $10,000. It was located on the corner of Central and University Boulevard. They changed the name to University Cleaners. They sold it in 1948, but it was returned to them by 1952 for nonprofit. To improve the business, they came up with some new innovative ideas, such as press as you wait and a 2-hour turnaround time for dry cleaned garments. They sold University Cleaners again in 1967-68, and they moved to a new location on 1617 Candelaria Northeast. At that point, Robert Randall III joined the partnership. They expanded the business to include uniforms and linen rentals. It was then renamed Delta Uniform and Linen. So they do the linen for a lot of the restaurants and casinos and uniforms for a lot of the areas too. For 3 seasons, starting in 2009 through 2011, Delta Linen was the location for the famous meth lab in the hit series Breaking Bad. The business is currently being managed by the 4th generation of the Randall family, Shelley Randall Snyder, Raymond's daughter. They have downsized it a bit this past year, as Ray and his wife Sherry are in their retirement years. By the way, there was a mention from one of them that there might be some more filming from the sequence of the Breaking Bad show there at Delta Linen coming up this year. At this point, I feel that we need to go back to the beginning days of Fairview, when C.D. Favor was the mortician that Strong purchased the business from back in 1882. There was a man, his name was Samuel Fike, who, according to the 1883 city directory, lived in the area northeast of the old Protestant cemetery. During this time, the journal mentions a problem with vicious dogs roaming the streets in the area of Railroad, which is Central, and 2nd Street. The butcher's dog attacked Fike's dog on one of these days, resulting in a dog fight between the two. Fike had already been warned to keep his dogs off the street, so he was fined and the butcher was not. But by May of 1887, Fike was listed in the city directory as the dog catcher. In the article named "Give Us the Good Old Times," published in 1933, Carl A. Snyder writes about Fike. He states that in addition to being a dog catcher, Fike was a smallpox nurse and a grave digger. He claims that during 1882, there was only one coffin being used for all the burials. According to the article, Fike would bury the deceased, and once the mourners left, he would unbury the coffin, rob the individuals of their valuables, throw them back in the grave, and resell the coffin. On January 5th of 1888, Fike joined those buried in historic Fairview Cemetery. His cause of death was listed as hydrophobia, more commonly known as rabies. And down here we have a picture of, this was in Strongthorn's basement of one of the old wicker caskets that were used. I think there was 2 of them down in the basement back about 10 years ago. I want to thank everybody that has helped me through the years with research, with family stories, with even helping me find locations for burials. And here's a list. It's kind of hard to read of some of the people. I hope I haven't left off anybody's name. And here is the address to my blog. Like I said, I've got close to 70 stories on there, and we keep trying to put out a story or 2 once a month. Oh, there's at least 200 that I could do, and eventually I will have it published into a book. Thank you, everybody, for letting me give this talk.
Susan, you can't quit
Thank
now. I'm ready to go on.